Welcome to Breakthrough News. I'm Eugene Perrier here once again alongside Rania Khalek as we continue our ongoing coverage regarding the continued attacks, the Israeli aggression happening all across Palestine, obviously most notably in Gaza, but also ongoing clashes over the weekend uh, inside of what's known as 48 Palestine, what others call inside of the Green Line, what some would say inside of Israel, and also on the West Bank, where over the weekend, popular resistance of various types increased relatively significantly in the face of in the face of the Gaza assault, which is bringing out more Palestinians, certainly across the West Bank. And there also have been ongoing clashes in East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, which was the genesis of really this entire situation here, this particular uptick in iteration. And so all of that ongoing, but the added element, of course, over the past weekend and really over the past week, we also saw massive, major demonstrations, tens of thousands of people all around the world, really every corner of the globe, expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people. And of course, last Saturday was the Nakba Day that commemorates, commemorate maybe is not the right way to say it, is a remembrance of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And so over the weekend, the conflict wore on, but the solidarity continued to grow in many different ways, Rania. So where we are right now, just to let folks know here as we start out the show, inside of Gaza, the health ministry in Gaza has confirmed that the death toll has reached 200 over the course of this conflict. Over 1,300 people have been wounded in Gaza. There's only 1 to 3 hours of electricity a day for the hospitals that are mainly using generators, but there's also a difficulty getting diesel fuel inside of Gaza. Now, the Rafah border crossing was opened by Egypt. A number of people were able to get into Egypt to receive healthcare, but nevertheless, very dire situation. Doctors Without Borders, and I believe one other health ministry clinic was struck. Two of the most experienced doctors in Gaza also killed. So terrible situation there in terms of the death toll. Over 40 children, I believe, were killed. And airstrikes have continued consistently and continue as we are speaking right now. There has been no real let up in the airstrikes from Israel. They have actually intensified over the past day, or the rocket fire coming from the resistance as well. And this all comes, of course, at the same time that the UN Security Council met on Sunday, and the United States yet again blocked a resolution that would have sort of both sides it nevertheless, but the U.S. doesn't even want to both sides it. They want Israel to have no culpability, it seems. So they have now opened up this new idea that they themselves are negotiating along with Egypt, along with Qatar, along with Saudi Arabia, to try to sideline the United Nations. So obviously, Rania, I think you and I were talking all weekend. We were live on Saturday. No real let up, it seems. Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, said on Sunday on CBS that things will continue at least for the next few days, despite the level of carnage we've seen so far, Rania.
And I'd like to add to that, Eugene, on top of everything you mentioned, there was this really massive escalation in the early morning hours of Sunday, when the Israelis launched, I think, something along the lines of 50 missiles. And I mean, we're talking about the most sophisticated weaponry here. This is not, it's the equivalent of the homemade rockets. 50 missiles in one area of Gaza, bombing residential homes. On the road, the main road that leads to Gaza's largest hospital, Al Shifa Hospital. You mentioned doctors have been killed. This attack killed two very prominent doctors in Gaza, including one of the chief of internal medicine at Al Shifa Hospital, Dr. Ayman Tawfiq Abu Al-Auf, was killed along with his two children, ages 13 and 17, in their home. In this bombing, another doctor, a neurologist, Dr. Muin Al-Alul, was also killed in this Israeli bombing. So these are two, Gaza, right? We know Gaza's under blockade. Gaza is dealing with a COVID emergency as it's dealing with this emergency. And you just lost two very important, very experienced physicians. Doctors are not easy to come by, especially when they have particular specialties. And this attack, it was on this main road that killed, I just mentioned those two doctors, but this was a massacre. Really, it killed about 42 people, including 10 children. And it was without warning. I'm talking residential buildings, bringing them on top of people as they were sleeping. This killed several families, multiple generations of one family. At least 17 members were killed. So this war is only escalating. And I want to just mention, this is intentional. We keep having, we keep talking about this. It's important to recognize Israel will say, oh, Hamas was there. But this targeting of media, like we saw with that building that came down the other day, this targeting without warning of residential homes is intentional. This is a war on civilians in a besieged ghetto who have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. They don't have bomb shelters. And the only reason they're being bombed and attacked like this is because they're Palestinian. That's it. This is an attack on Palestinians. And then Israel calls this mowing the grass. Every few years, Israel mows the grass, as their officials call it, in Gaza. And the idea is to just oppress and hurt and terrify and kill the population to such a degree that, they'll submit and turn against the resistance and stop supporting resistance. Obviously, that's not what's happening here. But this level of carnage, I mean, just what I described. And then on top of that, the U.S. for the third time in a week, obstructing a UN Security Council call for a ceasefire. I don't even understand at this point what the Biden administration thinks they have to gain from standing by this carnage. It doesn't, at this point, it's just they're accomplices to the ongoing murder of Palestinian children in Gaza. That's the only conclusion I can come to.
Well, I think that is a very logical conclusion, unfortunately, but it seems to be more or less the case. So as we start the show here, that is where we stand. 200 dead now in Gaza from the brutal air war being waged by the Israelis, 59 children, ongoing resistance as well coming from the Gaza Strip, looking like that conflict will continue as ongoing popular resistance continues to grow inside of the West Bank, despite over dozens of people actually who have been killed there in the West Bank by Israeli security forces, and ongoing inside of the 48 Palestine, ongoing violence towards Arabs, Palestinians inside of 48 Palestine as well. But it seems, Rania, this is the interesting thing, and in many ways the contradiction that the Biden administration finds itself within, is that on the one hand, they want to, and have been, of course, the way they campaign, trying to represent themselves as being so-called more tolerant on a range of issues than the Trump administration. But on this one, they have the exact same position as almost every American administration, which is total support for Israel, at the same time that the issue of total support for Israel is now fracturing here in the West, here in the United States in particular. And one thing I wanted to turn to here early in the show here, and I should say, if you're watching on YouTube, by the way, please make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the bell so you can get alerts about what's going on. We're going to be trying to bring you live coverage over the next few days as well as this continues to rage, this conflict. So please subscribe on YouTube, make sure you hit the bell, follow us at BT Newsroom on all your social media. But one of the things I want to start with is John Oliver's show on HBO. Now, I think you saw this, Ronnie. I did not see this. So this might be a cold reaction for me. So we'll see how I do here. But
I think you'll be a little bit pleasantly surprised just because of how mainstream John Oliver is.
And I'm very happy to see that. And I want to just roll this, but it's gotten quite a bit of notice over the last 12 hours or so, or a little bit more than that. John Oliver's piece on HBO this weekend regarding the issues over in Palestine. So we want to just roll that clip and then take it from there.
Look, there is a real tendency, particularly in America, to both sides this situation. And I'm not saying that there aren't some areas where that's warranted, but it's important to recognize there are also areas where it's simply not. Both sides are firing rockets, but one side has one of the most advanced militaries in the world. Both sides are suffering heartbreaking casualties, but one side is suffering them exponentially. And it's not like the US is operating from the moral high ground here. It's obviously no stranger to drone striking weddings and saying, we were just trying to target enemy combatants. This country has blood on its hands too. And look, if you believe Israel's actions are warranted and proportionate this week, You're welcome to try and make that argument. But we have got to start having this conversation honestly, and falling back on convenient, sanitized terms like real estate disputes and airstrikes on militants feels a little disingenuous when what you're describing is forcing people from the homes they've lived in for decades and killing civilians and children. And again, none of this frees Hamas from responsibility, but Hamas doesn't represent all Palestinians, just as what Israel is doing right now doesn't represent all Israelis or indeed Jewish people. Lots is complicated here, but some things are pretty simple. One side is suffering much more. And if America really wants to help, it might want to seriously consider changing its long-held position here, because for decades, the backbone of America's policy in the Middle East has been that America is an unwavering friend to Israel, which is a great thing to try and be. But at the end of the day, I would hope that a real friend would tell me when I'm being an arsehole, and definitely when I'm committing a fucking war crime.
Well, I have to say,
First talk about the positive and then the negative. Please. Positive, then negative. Go ahead.
Okay. Do you want? I should start. Is what you're looking for?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Positive. I think the main positive is that it recognized the big issue here, right? Which is the power imbalance. That whatever else we want to say, the idea that there's some equivalence between the sides is just completely and totally absurd. Now, that being said, I'd say the main bad is it feels like the both sidesing. He's like, well, you can't both sides it, but then he's kind of both sidesing it by equating somehow the rocket fire with the Israeli airstrikes, condemning that to a degree, basically saying, well, one side is committing really bad war crimes, so the other one might also be doing something wrong, but like that more or less trumps the overall issue with, the overall issue with the how bad it is. When really it seems like the bigger issue to me is obviously if someone's being brutally attacked, that they have a right to resist. As you pointed out Saturday in our live stream, Rania, there is in fact an internationally known right of the Palestinians to exist as an occupied people. So this is not just us saying it, but it's something that's also enshrined in international law. So that is the bad, but the good, I think, recognizing the key power imbalance, what's really happening, the hugely disproportionate number of people who are being killed, and I think just the overall absurdity of the arguments that are being made. I think it captured that well, honestly, and it captures, in a way, kind of the contradictions of the moment in terms of the rising sentiment in favor of Palestine, but the legacy of extreme pro-Israel sentiment here in the U.S.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I was a little bit frustrated, of course, when he's like, oh, like, Hamas is bad or whatever. Like, shut up, okay? Like, whatever, fine, shut up. But at the same time, I think that we can't, as frustrating as some of the, like, more annoying caveats are that we'll hear in the mainstream, I think there is something to be said that there is a shift in the tone of the conversation around this issue that cannot be denied. You are seeing some of the reality of the oppression, the settler colonialist nature of Israel against Palestinians really break through into CNN and MSNBC in a way like we've never really seen before. And, I'm not sure what necessarily accounts for that. Maybe it's because Israel's just moved so far right. And because this kind of anti-racist rhetoric has become so dominant, and that's not a bad thing, but maybe because it's become so dominant, it's becoming more difficult to justify Israel's actions and to see these videos. But I think there's also something to be said about the rise of like a new Palestinian generation that, the children of the immigrants, right? They're in politics. They're in academia in large numbers. They're in, they're not that they weren't educated before, but they're increasingly part of a professional educated class in Western countries that's able to articulate the experience of Palestinians in a language that Westerners can understand. Because Israel has this massive propaganda apparatus, spokespeople, like in every country around the world. They invest so much in what they call hasbara or explanation, which really just means propaganda. And Palestinians do not have, the resources, nor do they even have the state to push those resources into explaining their side of the conflict, right? And they've been easier to demonize because they're brown, they're predominantly Muslim. In the post-war on terror years, it was easy to just equate them all with Al-Qaeda, right? So I think that has begun to change in a way, because you see Palestinians being able to speak for themselves and given platforms to be able to explain their side of the argument. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also to do with younger people. I think younger people in America, in the West, are more progressive, are moving more towards the left. And there's no other way to look at this conflict if you're going to have those kinds of positions in the West. If you support like this kind of liberal democracy in America where everyone has equal rights, you can't support some like ethno-religious supremacist Sparta state in the Middle East. Those two things are just too big of a contradiction.
I think that's right on. And just a couple things to really build on that before we bring in our first two guests to talk more about this and some of what we saw over the weekend is, yeah, I think that the intersection of really the rise of social media and the rise of a young progressive generation has come together in a powerful way. I mean, in my view, the thing that really broke this issue open in a way that was profound was the Ferguson uprising of 2015 and that moment of Palestinians using Twitter to speak to the rebels on the street in Ferguson about how to deal with tear gas in real time that, you know, the people who were there on the ground in Ferguson have noted made a big difference in their ability to stay the course, to stay out there, to continue fighting. And the way that it happened on social media where everyone could see it, I think speaks to the broader issue where it's really broken the media blockade, if you will. Maybe not totally, and there's still a lot of nonsense, but it's harder to ignore the Palestinian voices. And as you said, a younger generation of Palestinians that is also tech savvy and knows how to communicate with their peers around the world in the same way has created an ability of there to be an exchange between popular movements in Palestine and here, unmediated as much as it were by all the different pieces. So I think that's an important element of it, is also how that rise of social media has facilitated those contacts. But all that being said, you know, what we have seen as a result of this has been the very youth-led mass protests all around the country, all around the world that have come out so largely since the conflict has begun, but last week into this weekend in a big way. And we want to bring in two of our Breakthrough News colleagues that were there on the ground in Washington, D.C., as well as in Brooklyn, here in New York City, where I'm based, where there was big demonstrations. We have Rachel Hu with us, and also Kay Pritzker from the Breakthrough News team who were there on the ground. Thank you both for joining us, Rachel and Kay. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Glad to be on.
Thanks for having us.
You know, Rachel, oh no, of course, Kay, please. Pleasure's all ours. But Rachel, you were on the ground there in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn on Saturday, which was, I think, one of the larger demonstrations, maybe even around the world, but a lot of notice there. Give us a sense of just what was the atmosphere? What did you see? How was the feeling? Just what was notable about that event? Walk us through it.
No, for sure. I mean, honestly, it was just so incredible. Like, there were 50,000 people in the streets, and we were in the streets. It seemed like maybe 6,000, you know, at most. That's what I really felt. But then I saw the aerial footage and I was like, oh my God, this thing stretched literally the entire neighborhood. And I mean, Bay Ridge, so for people who don't know much about Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, it's an area with a very large Palestinian population, a very large Arab population in general. And so you could just, when you were there, you could just see people just coming out of their homes and like pouring into the streets. I mean, at one point I saw this one kid, it was really, really powerful, where he was on the steps with his father and he had these like Palestinian flags on. And he had some, I'm not sure where, but it was a flag from a country in West Africa that he also had on at the same time. And him and his like little brother, they're like 9 years old, are just like, you know, waving flags for Palestine and chanting. And so I really think that was the energy. I mean, there was like fireworks being lit off. People had flares. I mean, people were really just, it was a mass community outpouring into the streets, and it really didn't stop. It went on late into the evening. I mean, police had to throw smoke bombs on protesters, and protesters really just weren't having it. Like, people continued to be out there and continued to resist. They even took a highway later on as well. So it's just a really incredible demonstration, in my opinion. And the number were outstanding, and just the energy and the fire and the how rooted it was in the community was itself just a spectacular event.
No, I definitely thank you for running that down. Kay, I saw some of your footage, but maybe just the same general question. What was the scene in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, it was very interesting to see Palestine so heavily represented in Washington, D.C. And, I lived in Washington, D.C. for several years, and that was easily the biggest demonstration for Palestine I had ever seen. It's hard to even guess. Like, I took a video of the march and, I posted on Twitter, but it cuts off at 2 minutes and 20 seconds. But there were even more people like coming from behind, but it was in the tens of thousands, and they marched right up to Congress. And obviously, that's been a huge part of this discussion is the U.S.'s complicity in all of this. And, to speak to your previous point, Eugene, like I think a lot of people are connecting the fact that, U.S. imperialism, U.S. police violence and police terrorism is really felt around the world because it's an export. It's, just like weapons, just like missiles that we're sending to Israel right now. Police violence and police terrorism is also an export of this country. And you see the same sort of tactics that are used on oppressed people in this country being used on Palestinians. So, I think beyond the fact that a lot of people are coming out for Palestine, I also think the connections that people are drawing are, also just tremendous. And I would definitely say I don't think any of this would have been possible had the uprising against police terrorism in this country not happened last summer. I really think, again, to speak to your point, Eugene, I think, this younger generation, especially in the United States, but also abroad, people feel this urge, this need to take a side. And I think there's this sort of general discourse, this, political discourse around you can't just be neutral. You are always on a side. And, it's irresponsible of you to just throw your hands up and say, I don't care what's happening in Palestine. People are really pushing others, their friends, their family to learn about this issue and to study it and to dance on this.
Yeah. No, I think great points all around. And Rachel, I mean, I think that's a really good point that Kay made that I saw in the demonstrations in New York last week it was really palpable the connections people were making between the various issues, the different struggles of oppressed people, Colombia as well. Did you see a similar sentiment out in Brooklyn this weekend?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we saw like for Colombia, it was really incredible. There was several different people that came out with Colombian flags that they had draped over, their shoulders, and there were chants in Spanish also that people were leading, which was really amazing, like "Viva Viva Palestina," which was really powerful and palpable to see. There was so much connection between the struggles and the movements. And to kind of what Kay was saying as well, I mean, I had spoken with many of the youth Palestinian activists here in New York, and they're really saying that these numbers are the largest numbers that they have seen, within their organizing. I mean, it is outstanding. Like, I remember the last time we had a mass action for Palestine in New York, it was in 2014. We took the Brooklyn Bridge, and there was definitely, I think, about 5,000 or 6,000 of us back then. And that's what it was earlier in the week, but about 6,000 people in Times Square as well, moving through Times Square to Columbus Circle. But, the number of 50,000 was just, so beyond what we even expected. I expected a few tens of thousands, but this was just so much. And everyone was really out there making those connections. It really wasn't just, one population or the other. It was just such a Brooklyn kind of led movement in a sense, right? Like all of the working people from all different sectors of Brooklyn came out, and also probably across New York City. I mean, we started with like 2,000 people, and then to find out that we ended up with just like blocks and blocks and blocks of people is just astounding. So I definitely want to say the solidarity was there. People were definitely making the connections between, like what was done in 2014 between Ferguson and Palestine. Those same connections were being made in this demonstration between police brutality and its connection to Palestine historically, not just through, of course, the United States training its police chiefs in Israel, but also a variety of the programs that people see here today that have been Palestinians. So I do think a lot of those points came out in speeches and also in just discussions with others.
Well, Rania, I want some of your thoughts about what you saw in these demonstrations, but quickly, just want for those who have just joined us here, this is the Breakthrough News emergency live stream, I guess the best way to call it. We just want to keep coming live and bringing you updates on what's happening. According to the health ministry in Gaza, 200 killed in the ongoing aerial assault of the Gaza Strip, also artillery and naval fire being used. 200 dead in the Gaza Strip over this conflict, 59 of them children. And that aerial assault, also including naval and ground, as in artillery units, ongoing there. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel told CBS's Face the Nation program on Sunday that there would be continued additional days and that there would be continued ramping up of conflict by the Israelis inside of 48 Palestine, or as some would say, inside of Israel, ongoing issues of Palestinian people there being targeted by these just very, very racist forces who are brutally targeting people. Palestinians also standing up for themselves as well, and what many are saying is an unprecedented uprising by Palestinians inside of what some call the Green Line ongoing. And the West Bank also saw a significant increase in protests, despite dozens of people who were killed. And in Sheikh Jarrah, which was really the centerpiece and continues to be the centerpiece of what lit off this particular situation, there were ongoing issues yesterday. Some people were killed on both sides as the Israeli police tried to prevent people from gathering really in the area and showing their support with Sheikh Jarrah. So that continues to be a flashpoint, as does East Jerusalem and the Damascus Gate in particular. So that's where we are. Obviously, the issue in Gaza being really the principal issue, 200 killed by the Israeli air forces there and other forces, as it were, as that continues to roll on, including 59 children. But Rania, your thoughts on some of what we saw this weekend in terms of these mass protests?
Yeah, real quick, I just want to note that the numbers you just mentioned, 59 children out of 200 dead, that is a 30%. That's 30% of the dead in Gaza are children. 30% of the people Israel has killed in Gaza are children. That should make you question any Israeli claim about what they're targeting. These are not military targets. They are targeting civilians. And that is why so many people came out in cities across the country. And I think it's so important when this happens for people. I think America is the most important place to be protesting this, because we all know our government gives Israel $3.8 billion a year in unconditional military aid. Those F-16s, those Hellfire missiles, those bunker buster bombs that Israel's dropping on Gaza, those are American provided. Those are coming from us. And so these protests were incredible to see, and they're always incredible to see because it shows that the US government does not necessarily represent the views or attitudes of Americans. And I think that, I'd love to ask Rachel and Kay, because you guys have been active in Palestine solidarity for years. I think we all have. And just being on the ground as people involved in some of the organizing and the activism, I'm curious your thoughts on, is this time different in terms of the protests on the ground? Are there more people? Are there newer people? Is it a little bit more widespread than sort of just the typical activist community that comes out to oppose these bombing campaigns? I guess let's go with Rachel first.
Yeah, no, without a doubt, something is in the air. Like I was saying this earlier to Sierra, who's actually one of my co-hosts for It's Not Youth's Capitalism. And we were talking about this, something just feels different this time. And I can't put my finger exactly on what, but then we started kind of reflecting and walking back and thinking through it. And so much of it has to do with the uprising in the summer and just this kind of general feeling amongst working class people in America that we've had enough, just enough in general with the pandemic, with police brutality and just the clear kind of reality that the mask of the system has come off. We kind of all look at the United States as a country. We see the injustice at the border. We see the injustice happening to Black and brown people in the streets. It really isn't that much of a leap to then recognize the United States' relationships with countries around the globe and all of the funding it gives to Israel. And I think a lot of people that came out in the streets in the summer, just like in 2014 when this strong connection with Palestine was made, I think so much of, especially the Black liberation movement that I've noticed has this very strong internationalism with Palestine. And so I think a lot of people over the summer that started to come out really started to get in contact with this issue and starting to learn about it. The fact that, what you had John Oliver on earlier, the fact that that was even said, this kind of shifting attitude I've noticed as well. It's kind of a new line that I've seen come out from this kind of liberals and in the kind of like, progressives kind of sphere. And I think it's very interesting because I think the mass consciousness of people has shifted in a sense on Palestine. We've had greater numbers. I mean, LA had this massive action. It's just really incredible to see how many people have been in the streets and how many people start to care. And so what I was saying about John Oliver is I really think that the ruling class in so many ways is starting to take a slightly different approach. I've noticed it. I've seen this new way of talking about things where it's like, it's not the Israeli people, it's the Israeli state. And I think that that language itself kind of comes from the language that we had over the summer about talking about the way systems work in terms of relationships of states. And so that's just my kind of perspective on it. But I have noticed even more people that are talking about this issue, they're starting to say things a little bit more like it's the Israeli state, it's not the people of Israel. And now they're starting to draw different lines in the sand, whereas kind of outright, Israeli chauvinism has kind of been par for the course up until this point.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. Really quickly, I just want to give a shout out to the people who are supporting us in the super chat. As everybody who's watched this knows, and those who are just tuning in, if you throw in money in the super chat, we will give you a shout out and read your comment, assuming it's not anything too insane. So this is from Y Jalma. Keep up the great work, Rania. Also, keep smacking down those solitary breakers. Any chance you'll have Robert Inlakesh on? I'm looking into that. And then another supporter, the sky at night raw, ! Hashtag under the dome. No comment, just a donation, but thank you. And I'd like to remind those who are watching that you can also support Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. It helps support our journalism, our ability to give you live coverage like this, our ability to be on the ground in various places. And of course, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that little bell button so you get a notification. Now, back to what we were discussing, Kay, I know that you've been involved in Palestine Solidarity since you were in college as a part of SJP. And so I'm curious your views on, do you think this is like an unprecedented kind of ground shaking, narrative shifting moment? And do you see more and more people coming out and raising their voices in support of Palestine against this settler colonialist aggression? Oh, you're muted, Kay. Oh, still muted. Okay, not sure what's wrong with. Yeah, no, and it might be an RN. Not sure. Let's get Kay's audio figured out.
While we wait for Kay, just to note the issue.
Oh, there he is. There he is. Kay's on. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I do think it's different this time. I mean, it's definitely different this time. I remember when I first joined SJP at George Washington University, we had 4 members, and like our first meeting, we had like 2 people show up. This was in like 2016. But yeah, now it seems like everyone knows about this issue. Everyone has an opinion. And, I really think the big difference is not just the uprising like Rachel alluded to. I also think a big change since, I guess you could say 2014, like the last major conflict, is that I think there's a lot more consciousness also around the nature of the United States and what the United States represents in the world. Since 2014 and, since Trump was elected, you saw the United States just openly showing its sort of imperialist, this quest for world domination. And it sponsored a lot of these right-wing fascist client states or sort of coup mongers, like Juan Guaido in Venezuela. They tried to have like a right-wing coup in Bolivia. Donald Trump was threatening genocide against the North Koreans and was also sponsoring terrorism in Syria and all this. And I think people saw this and they kind of lump Israel in with the rest of that. Israel is another client state of the United States, and they see all the awful racism, the fascist sort of tendency that Israel is walking towards. And they say, this is just like every other country that the U.S. is propping up some military dictatorship, or they're trying to fund some right-wing coup monger to take over the government. Israel is no different. And, the fact that Israel receives the most military aid from the most foreign aid period from the United States, I think and, this sort of treasured relationship where these politicians say, we want to support an Israel that shares values with us. I think a lot of young progressive people are interpreting that honestly. They're seeing and they're saying, yeah, the U.S. and Israel do share values. They have shared values, which are, endless war, shoot first, ask questions, never, and totally, just wipe your hands clean, never face justice, never submit to the International Criminal Court or anything like that. And, you just see the way the U.S. always has Israel's back when it comes to human rights inquiries, when it comes to delegitimizing Palestinian statehood, that it's the U.S., Israel, and usually a few other right-wing U.S. client states that always stand on the same side. I saw some pictures of there was a video of a Venezuelan rally. It was like a right-wing Venezuelan rally, and everyone there is like waving Israeli flags. Jair Bolsonaro, the fascist president of Brazil, is a huge supporter of Israel. So is Modi in India. I think people are really connecting Israel's fascist, disgusting ethnic cleansing of Palestine with the rest of the global international fascist, movement, which is led by the United States. So I think that's really another major difference here.
No, that's a really excellent point. So sorry, go ahead, Eugene. I hear you.
No. I was just gonna say I think that those are very well taken points.
I want to add something. I want to add something about young people really quickly before I forget. My niece, I have a 14-year-old niece, and she told me something really interesting. And she told me that, she was looking through her Instagram story feed, and she was like telling me because she doesn't know all the details and nuances of what's happening, but she understands there's something happening, especially since she's seeing even her own classmates share stories about it. 14 years old, 9th grade. And she told me among her generation, she only sees people supporting Palestine. And she actually said, I think it's like, she was like, yeah, it's like when George Floyd was killed, all the people are sharing, they were like pro BLM, now they're pro Palestine. She's like, I think if anybody like shared something pro Israel, they'd be bullied. And I just thought that was funny because it really does represent a huge generational shift in how this issue is perceived and understood. And I think social media has a lot to do with it, but also just there's like a left-wing politics that's risen among younger people. And I don't want to give, the youngest generation too much credit, but I do think because of capitalism, because of wealth inequality, because of the way that neoliberalism and capitalism are decaying, it's made young people a little bit more radical. And with that radicalism comes an understanding to some extent of imperialism. And Israel and the United States and Saudi Arabia and all these European countries, these are the capitalist imperialist countries and their client states. And that's that's team capitalism, that's team imperialism. And people are starting to understand the world in that sort of way. Imperialism, capitalism versus the rest of us. And so I think it's important just to recognize that at least, in this one little microcosm of young people, my niece is telling me, yeah, I don't see anybody saying Israel's right or justifying Israel's action. So I think that's really important.
No, well, I also think that's important. I just wanted to note that pretty much everyone here has raised the issue of the power imbalance and the just disproportionality in this conflict. And I want to note, in Gaza, 200 killed. The Israelis are reporting 10 people killed, 59 children reported killed in Gaza, 2 in Israel. So, 200 to 10, 59 to 2. If you don't question that, really, it's just really unbelievable. And I think those numbers kind of say it all regarding the disproportionality. So, Rachel, I appreciate you joining us. And I'll also note that in addition to being our Breakthrough News colleague, you are at the helm there of Women Fight Back every Friday on WBAI and also available as a podcast. Last Friday, you guys had a great show with Palestinian organizers, some folks on the ground in Gaza. So I hope they check you out. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us here on this live stream. I'm sure we'll probably see you later this week as we continue bringing people as many updates as we can. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Make sure you hit the bell as well. Okay, stay with us. We're going to bring in another one of our colleagues here from Breakthrough News. We want to bring here next Monica Cruz, who is, among other things, the host of On the Picket Line, a weekly labor podcast that we do here. Monica, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Well, we are happy to have you. You know, one other element of what we saw over the weekend in terms of international solidarity took place with dock workers over in Italy. If you could, Monica, just run down for folks what happened.
That's right. So after receiving a report from an organization called the Weapon Watch, which is an NGO based in Genoa that monitors arms shipments in European and Mediterranean ports, they informed the USB. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it in Italian, which is a union of dock workers across Italy, and they let them know that this particular ship contained weapons and explosives, and they quickly shut it down and said that they would refuse to unload the shipment off that ship. Of course, there was not an all around action. So it was just the folks at this particular union, at this particular port, that said no. So, the shipment was able, to make its way out of Italy. But I think it's still a really incredible stance, a really powerful statement from this union, the USB, saying that it will not be an accomplice in the massacre of Palestinian people, calling out, as y'all have spoken about so well already, the hundreds of civilian victims, including many children. So I think this was a really beautiful example and an important example of the kind of power that workers can have when they unite with the cause of all oppressed peoples across the world, but particularly for this issue of Palestine. I just think about the hundreds, the countless dock workers, shipment workers, delivery workers, folks who work in weapons manufacturing facilities across this world, who can have that same impact, who can rise up and do the same thing, and really shut this entire thing down. And of course, it is those at the top, the elite, that make these decisions, but it is us workers who make the world go round, period. So I think solidarity from the labor movement is something that we need to continue to encourage in terms of this struggle for Palestinian liberation.
No, I appreciate that report and that update. Is there anything else that you've seen? I mean, I've seen a little bit, I haven't paid super close attention, from the labor movement that caught your eye in terms of solidarity with Palestine.
For sure. I mean, across the world, we've seen a host of different trade union councils express solidarity for Palestine and explicitly call the situation what it is: apartheid, what it is, occupation. So from the Cambridge Trade Union Council, which is one of the largest pro-Palestinian organizations in the UK, came out with a strong statement, and we're at present organizing actions across the country over the weekend. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions also with an incredible statement of support. Of course, the Irish know very, very well the issue of occupation and resistance in that effort. And there's a beautiful long history of Palestinian and Irish solidarity against colonialism. Also, the National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa. I mean, what else is there to say there? The descendants, probably many who lived through the brutality of apartheid in South Africa, coming together in solidarity with Palestine. Also in Italy, the Metal Workers Union of Italy, the FIOM, and the French Labor Federation, the CGT, also came out with statements of support. And of course, across many of these places, all of these places, we saw tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands cumulatively come out in support of Palestine over the weekend. So that was really exciting to see on the international front. In terms of the labor movement here in the US, in some ways, not as much of a surprise. We haven't seen the the largest unions issuing statements of support, like we've seen across Europe and in other places. But we have seen some smaller unions, including the UE, or the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, repping some 35,000 workers, issuing a strong statement condemning apartheid in Israel. The Unite Here Local 23, representing some 25,000 hospitality workers across the South, also put out a statement in support of Palestine. The University of California Student Workers Union also put out a statement. The Georgetown Alliance of Graduate Employees, also the News Guild, the new union with the CWA, the largest union of journalists and communications professionals, put out a statement specifically condemning the Israeli bombing of the offices that housed the AP and Al Jazeera, as y'all have mentioned, that happened over the weekend. So, a lot of really important support. I think historically more support than we have seen in the U.S. for the issue of Palestine. But again, I think it just signals to a lot of the ways that the labor movement needs to step up their game and, really push forward a politic that is truly progressive, in that it stands for working class people of all nationalities, of all backgrounds, of every corner of the world. That's the only way that workers here are going to win, by building that internationalism. And I think this is a moment, for labor to really reconcile those things. We know the more progressive and left wing pieces of the labor movement have been decimated, in a really concerted campaign. That's a whole nother live show. That's a whole nother episode of On the Picket Line, wherever you have it. But I think it's very clear in a lot of ways that here in 2021, it's a new day for labor. We're seeing the way that industries that have never seen unions before are organizing. We're seeing the breadth and the depth of the labor movement grow in so many new exciting ways here in the US. So I think it's interesting to see how the rest of this situation plays out and how US labor will respond.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's amazing to hear. And thank you again, Monica. I mean, that's comprehensive. It's things going on in every corner of the world with trade unions. And I think you're 100% right on with the US labor movement. It's maybe small compared to the rest of the world, but still a bigger opening. And it raises a big issue, and it will raise a big issue around the BDS movement, since many unions are invested in these Israeli bonds in their retirement packages. It's something that's heavily promoted as, a very stable bond. Obviously, people want stable retirement. It's also another show about, how we get our retirement and our seniors. But I think it's definitely a turning point in a lot of ways on so many different levels. Kay, I mean, I just don't know if you want to maybe comment on that. I think what Monica is saying is very profound in terms of the breadth and the depth of this.
Yeah, stories like this make me feel so optimistic because, I think a lot of people, they see Israel bombing the Palestinians, and it feels a little helpless, like, what can we really do? But I think a lot of people forget, in this whole capitalist game, like all of us as workers were caught up in this whole rich man's game where they, have us make bombs here in the US and ship them over to Israel so they can blow up a bunch of other workers who, are just as poor and oppressed as us, if not more. And, but at the same time, there are these like single points of failure. Like a bunch of workers at one port can just say, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going to send the bombs. A group of workers can just get together and say, hey, we're not going to make these bombs anymore. Or maybe, a union says, hey, we're not going to invest our pensions into Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and all these people. And then the whole house of cards collapses. And, the Israeli, regime and the U.S. imperialists, they all rely on workers to carry out these sort of wars and these, wars of imperialist plunder. So, I think seeing this, I hope a lot of other workers follow suit, and I'm sure they will. And, the last thing is, I mean, the Israelis, I mean, the people in Gaza, not only are they workers, like the Israelis are really punishing the people of Gaza, not just by bombing them, but also by restricting their access to to trade and to jobs. I mean, the unemployment rate in Gaza is regularly over 50%. I mean, people have nothing to do because the whole economy is blockaded. They can't import or export anything because of this lie of this dual use policy, which basically is an Israeli policy that says we can't allow Gaza to import anything that could have a secondary terroristic purpose. that could be used to make weapons. But these are things like cement. Like these are things like that people used to build homes. I mean, it's medicine. It's ambulances and things. This is why, the siege of Gaza is called the siege of Gaza. It's not just a bombing campaign. It's a total medieval blockade, and Gaza's economy is being strangled. So, I support the workers of Gaza, and I want to see the siege of Gaza fall. It's a crime against humanity.
I think it's an important moment to note that Palestinians across historic Palestine have called for a general strike tomorrow. And that includes Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank. Obviously, Palestinians in Gaza can't participate in the same way in something like that, considering their current situation. But I mean, I think it's important to recognize that even Palestinians on the ground are trying to organize in some fashion, a way to utilize that ability as a worker. We know that Palestinians in the West Bank often end up being the workers who build the settlements because they're desperate for jobs. And to what Kay was mentioning about the de-development in Gaza, that is what Israel has also done to the economy in the West Bank, de-developed it. And so Palestinians in the West Bank are often reliant on jobs that serve the Israeli settlements as, in menial positions. And the same goes for Palestinians inside Israel, the ones who are citizens of Israel. Palestinians make up 20% of the Israeli population inside what is recognized by the UN as the country of Israel. They have Israeli citizenship, but they are discriminated against. Their community, 50% of them live under the poverty line. They lack access to the same resources as Israeli Jews. Their schools are neglected and underfunded, much in the same way as oppressed communities in the US. They definitely are economically starved. And as a result, you'll often hear, especially with the current protests taking place across 48 Palestine, you'll hear Israeli officials call them criminal elements, right? These are just gangs that are rioting. It's much the same language you'll hear when inner cities that have been economically neglected in our country rise up. And I think that's part of the connection we were talking about earlier. And I do want to point out to people, after you are finished watching this live stream, we did just post a video with somebody who's the head of a civil rights organization inside Palestine that works on behalf of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And she, in the video, in the interview, she speaks about the terror that Palestinians of Israel are facing right now. They are being chased and hunted down by organized Israeli Jewish settler mobs inside Israeli cities, attacking mixed neighborhoods, attacking Arabs, painting red marks on their homes to try to identify which houses are Arab so they can attack them later, asking them on the street, can I have a cigarette, or do you know where this is, to see what accent they respond in to determine whether they're Arab so they can attack them. What's happening inside of Israel right now is very frightening because the police are actually assisting and standing idly by as these settler mobs attack Palestinians. They're afraid to walk alone at night. This is really, they have no protection. They don't have anyone defending them. They can't call the police because the police are on the side of the settlers. And this story has really, there's been a media blackout on it in the US press because, of course, for rightfully so, the cameras are pointed at Gaza right now. But we can't forget that this is an all-out assault on Palestinians who are also being shot at and killed in the West Bank and who are being arrested. I mean, Haaretz came out with a story yesterday, an Israeli news outlet, and they noted that of the people who've been arrested and charged in Israel for so-called rioting so far, 116 people, every single one of them is Arab. Not a single Israeli Jew has been arrested and charged in Israel, despite the fact that there are settler mobs organizing on social media quite openly, organizing to go hunt down Palestinians and hurt them. And the vast majority of the 100, we hear a lot in the US media, if we hear about the story, that, Arabs and Jews are attacking each other. Well, the vast majority of the 116 Palestinian citizens of Israel who've been indicted have been indicted on charges of assaulting police officers. So it's pretty much BS. And this is an attack on a side that has nobody to defend them. So I really want people to recognize and understand that that's also happening against a defenseless population inside a country that calls itself a democracy, but has, 50 laws on the Israeli books that explicitly discriminate against non-Jews.
Well, I think that's such an important point, Rania, because it speaks to this broader point of the media, and certainly reminds me of something, that just the connection that Monica was made. And thank you to Monica and Kay, our Breakthrough News colleagues, for joining us here in our rolling coverage. But, there being a statement from the News Guild here in the United States against the bombing of the tower, the media tower, and the role of journalists being organized in unions as a serious voice against the distortions of the media, or an alternative voice, because the point you just made, that there are these pogroms happening inside of 48 Palestine, the Green Line, Israel, whatever you want to call it, people being attacked, people being assaulted, homes being marked. And we talked about this on Saturday a little bit, Rania, the gentleman I saw on ABC News, this ridiculous interview they were doing with them, and they said, well, what do you want? He said, I just want to be protected. Like, there's these settlers rolling around with Uzis. The police are defending them. We have no one to protect us. And I raise all that to say that because in the media, the Israeli government is saying that they're against it. And they're saying, we're going to stand up against this. We're going to be about it. You had Benjamin Netanyahu say that they would be willing to use administrative detention, which they only use against Palestinians. They're saying, oh, we got the Shin Bet in there, the elite, intelligence agency. So they're trying to create this perception in the broader international media that they both see and hear this critique. Mm-hmm. And there's like, oh, no, we know this is bad. We're against racism, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at the numbers you just said, I'll actually ask you to repeat what you just said for people who are just joining us, because I think it's deeply notable. It's the exact opposite with what's portrayed. But, for the average people, you're busy. You can't spend hours and hours and hours reading everything. And so you just read, okay, well, yeah, that sounds bad, but I heard Netanyahu say they care about it. And you miss what you just said about the reality of what's happening inside 48 Palestine and who's being targeted and who's being arrested.
Yeah, so I'll repeat that number again. There's been 116 people in Israel indicted in lieu of these this intercommunal violence as it's being portrayed between Jews and Arabs. Every single one of them is Arab. None of them are Israeli Jews. Meanwhile, you have settler mobs with the complicity and sometimes support of Israeli police hunting and hurting Palestinians, walking around with guns, throwing stones at Palestinian cars, stopping cars to find out who's in it. And if it's a Palestinian, beating them up, marking their homes with red paint so that they can identify who is Palestinian and who's not in these mixed neighborhoods. So Palestinians right now are very frightened. And to mention what you're talking about with these Israeli officials going on English-speaking media and saying, oh, we condemn these mobs, right? It's the opposite in the Hebrew media. What I was told by our guest today in the interview we posted a little bit ago, she said that Israeli media is actually inciting against Palestinians. Furthermore, Netanyahu will speak in English in one way, and then he goes and speaks to Israelis in Hebrew, and he actually went to the city of Lod, where there's been a lot of violence between Jews and Arabs. He actually went there, and he gave a statement to the police saying, he said this in Hebrew, we support you. Don't worry about any investigations. You do what you have to do. There won't be any inquiries. That is a green light to shoot people if you want to. Imagine if somebody in America said that to police. Do what you want. There won't be any investigations. You go deal with these BLM protesters how you see fit. That would be a green light to shoot and kill people. And then there's Amir Ohana, the head of public security in Israel. And this guy, when there was a man last week that precipitated all of this. He was a Palestinian man. There was a protest by Palestinian citizens of Israel in the city of Lod in support of Sheikh Jarrah before Gaza was being relentlessly bombed. And one of the Palestinian men who was at that protest was shot and killed by an Israeli Jew. And this guy was later arrested. And so Amir Ohana publicly said, he said, this man should not be arrested. He condemned the arrest of the man who shot the Palestinian. And furthermore, he called these armed Jewish civilians, these armed Jewish settlers, he called them force multipliers. Force multipliers is how he referred to Israeli Jewish lynch mobs. That is frightening rhetoric, and that is incitement. So they speak one way in English, they speak a very different way to the Israeli public. And I do, after you're done watching this live stream, I really do encourage you to go listen to this interview with Soha Salman Musa. She's the executive director of the Musawa Center. It's a civil rights group inside Israel that promotes the rights of Palestinians of Israel. And she's in Haifa right now, and she's frightened. She's frightened to walk alone at night or even during the day right now. She is absolutely frightened, and so are many other Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Wow. Well, I really do encourage people to go watch that. And for those who may just be joining us here at the top of the hour, you are watching a live here on Breakthrough News. We are continuing our rolling live coverage as we have throughout the past week and into this week of the ongoing Israeli aggression inside of Palestine. We stand here now with at least 200 dead in Gaza, at least 59 dead as a result of the Israeli bombardment, which is, of course, by air, and at different times it has been by sea and also by artillery. So 200 dead there, 59 children. The resistance in Gaza continues to be active. The Israelis have reported 10 dead, including 2 children. So it gives you a sense of the level of disproportionality in this conflict, 200 versus 10. And of course, as Rania was just speaking to there, for those who just joined, inside of quote unquote Israel, inside of 48 Palestine, within the Green Line, there continues to be significant coverage, significant violence happening there as part of what really has been an uprising of Palestinian people to defend themselves against these aggressive pogrom type attacks that started really during Ramadan and were very intimately tied to what we saw in Sheikh Jarrah that really set off this entire conflict. And of course, in Sheikh Jarrah, protests continuing to happen over the weekend. A number of Israeli soldiers were wounded in an active resistance there by someone in the West Bank. Popular resistance has been growing in the West Bank, despite dozens of people who have been killed, Palestinians in the West Bank. The reports in the Israeli media are that the protests continue to grow there and the resistance continues to grow. Mr. Barghouti from the BDS movement said over the weekend, I think something that sums it up, that the Israelis are struggling to deal with the ongoing resistance in Gaza, the popular resistance in the West Bank, and the ability of Palestinians inside of 48 Palestine to offer a full spectrum resistance in a range of different pieces. Mr. Avigdor Lieberman, one of the most right-wing individuals inside of Israel, also stating that really that Israel, despite its outward show of strength, that in fact they have been unable to actually cope with the steadfastness and ability of Palestinians to resist. Now, some of that was political. He's trying to position for elections, but I thought that was a notable statement to make about the impact of Palestinians, even though they have almost nothing in terms of their ability to resist. They have been able to offer a really full spectrum peace that even the Israelis are struggling to deal with. So 200 dead in Gaza from the aerial bombardment on the Palestinian side, 59 children, 10 dead on the Israeli side, 2 children. And of course, there's ongoing clashes, dozens of Palestinians killed in the West Bank.
So real quick, I just want to give a shout out, as I promised to 2 people in the super chat. Tony, 1987, said solidarity with workers around the world. Right on, Tony. Oscar, Chris, and Muna Bristol said, great show, Ronnie and Eugene. As an Anglo-Palestinian family, we are so overwhelmed by the solidarity shown to Palestinians, and we're relieved the conversation around the occupation is finally shifting. Again, if you want to throw donations into the super chat, we will give you a shout out and read your comment on air. Furthermore, you can support Breakthrough News and the coverage that we're doing here. Patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And I just want to note, like, I feel really grateful that we have this outlet, Breakthrough News, and that we're able to do this because, when I turn on the media, I'm not seeing regular live coverage of what's taking place. There's people being carpet bombed right now by an American-supported government. And, Americans really aren't, CNN is not covering it as they should be covering it. They have the resources to, but they're not. And so if you're watching the mainstream media, they're not, first of all, of course, they're not giving you the right picture, but they're also ignoring it. So I am grateful that, that we have this outlet to provide this platform to be able to talk about this in the way it should be discussed.
No, so am I. And of course, today, one of the themes we really want to bring forward is this outpouring of support that we have seen for Palestine. Of course, really over the past, really the whole time this has been ongoing, but really over the past weekend in a major way. That we want to bring on next Satya Vati, who is an activist with the Answer Coalition in Atlanta. And Satya, we appreciate you joining us last second, giving us some of your time. But you're based there in Atlanta. For those who don't know, it's in the southeastern part of the United States. You know, very few people expect anything progressive to happen in the South. Now, that might be in and of itself a mistaken belief, but I saw at least a few photos, snippets, Satya, from the South over this weekend, especially Saturday, that people were coming out all across the region in solidarity with Palestine. Tell us a little bit of what you saw over the weekend in your region.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, first of all, Eugene and Rania. Yeah, we've been seeing solidarity demonstrations for Palestine all across the United States and cities across the US. And that's the same for the South as well. You know, we've seen actually unprecedented turnouts in the South when it comes to the solidarity demonstrations for Palestine. These are actually some of the largest rallies we've seen for Palestine in the South, in what people call the Deep South. You know, in Atlanta, Georgia, we saw almost 3,000 people come out. In Raleigh, North Carolina, 4,000 people came out. And to my knowledge, that has to be the biggest demonstration for Palestine in the state of North Carolina. And also, we saw hundreds of people come out in Tampa, in Miami, Florida, in New Orleans, Louisiana, in Memphis, Tennessee. I mean, it's really unprecedented to see this type of international solidarity for Palestine, especially from the Deep South. And, you know, the Palestinian community itself in the South has turned out in, you know, big numbers. We saw a multi-generational crowd, grandparents, parents, a lot of youth, even a lot of children, you know, people of all ages, really all nationalities. It was a very multinational crowd that came out. And I think that what we're seeing in the South, the solidarity movement for Palestine in the Deep South, I think it's actually an influence of the mass rebellion against police brutality and racism that took place last year. You know, where we started seeing massive demonstrations in you know, major cities in the South, including Atlanta, where 10,000 people came out for one of the biggest demonstrations last summer. And there's a reason for why that is. And that reason is that the United States itself has a history of genocide, of apartheid, and racism. And, you know, people are starting to draw those connections between the struggle for Black liberation and the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation from Israeli apartheid.
You know, I think those are such important points, Satya, and really of a piece of what we've been hearing from people around the country, especially about the impact of the Black liberation movement and really being a catalyst for the growth of solidarity with Palestine. I mean, you know, one of the things that others have been saying, obviously those of us, you know, who have been out for Palestine for a while were there, but that, and I think this was implied in your comments, but I'm curious your thoughts about this, that it really was just another sign of a new generation of people who have really been radicalized in this country over the past 5 years.
Yeah, I would say that that's absolutely correct. I completely agree with that, Eugene. I mean, we saw a lot of people in the streets over the past few days in the South that have never come out into the street before. And, you know, for so long, Israel, with the support of the US government, has wanted to wipe out Palestine from the memory of the world. For example, if you go on Google Images right now and you type in map of the Middle East, you don't see Palestine on most of those maps. It's just Israel. And but you know what, the crimes that the Israeli government is now committing against the Palestinian people, the terrorism that it's inflicting on the Palestinian people, it sparked resistance, of course, within Palestine itself. And that resistance within Palestine has now given way to a mass global solidarity movement for the Palestinian people, which the United States and Israel don't actually want to see. They don't want to see a mass movement, a mass global solidarity movement for Palestine be sparked. And there's a reason behind that. When a mass movement sparks off, a lot of people become open to learning. They become open to new information. They become open to challenging what they already know or what they think they already know. And then there's those people who are on the fence, who haven't yet taken a position on the issue. So, of course, we're seeing thousands of people in the streets, but there's also millions of people that are watching who are not in the streets, who are now asking the question about, well, what's actually happening what is Palestine? What is Israel? What actually is the conflict? Now people are going to want to go look for answers. They're going to want to study. They're going to watch documentaries. And on social media, there's a huge effort by organizations to use this moment to educate people. We see a lot of educational content coming up, books on Palestine, documentaries on Palestine are once again kind of resurfacing. And that's important because when there is a mass movement, there's an opportunity for a shift in mass consciousness. And that's actually what we're seeing here in the United States and across the world. Once these people start digging about Palestine, it's impossible to dig into the history of Palestine and then to not also learn about the anti-colonial struggles in the Arab world, the role of imperialism in the Middle East, the endless wars of the US empire in the Middle East over the past 3 decades and even prior to that. People are going to see all of that. And then, they're going to start to challenge, the system itself and the US government. So people are going to start drawing those connections. So one thing can actually lead to another. And that's why the ruling class is actually opposed to seeing this resistance movement kind of take off inside the United States, but also across the world.
Well, let me ask you this final piece, Satya, building on everything you've just said, from the thousands out in cities like Atlanta and Raleigh to the possibility of mass struggle. I think many people wonder what is the possibility for real change in the United States. Seeing movements like this in the so-called most conservative part of the country, does it give you hope that there is, here in the belly of the beast, the ability to shift where things are in terms of policy on the Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm really glad that I was asked that question today because, there's a perception about the South. There's a perception about the Deep South in the United States. People kind of write it off like, right-wing states, they're backward. Yes, there are backward elements in the Deep South, just like there's backward elements in most states across the United States. However, the most backward thing about the Deep South is the political leadership, that has maintained poverty, racism. That's the most backward element within the Deep South. And, we have to actually build movements to get rid of that political leadership, those that are controlling the economy, and really bring the control of the economy and the political system into the hands of everyday people, working class people. Now, the South actually has a radical tradition. It has a tradition and legacy of struggle, for Black liberation. Major labor struggles have taken place in the South. The movement for socialism was once very strong in the Deep South. So this goes all the way back. We can go back to the days of the Civil War. We can go back to the fight against slavery, to the fight against Jim Crow, to the fight for civil rights for Black people in this country. The South was the home to the civil rights movement. And, Black radical organizations like SNCC, the Black Panther Party, they stood firmly with the Palestinian people because they saw the struggle for Black liberation and the struggle for Palestine as one and the same, because they saw that the oppressor was the same, which ultimately was US imperialism. And they saw for the need for both people to unite against a common oppressor. And of course, like I was saying, the US itself was also an apartheid state. until the civil rights movement kind of changed that. So even today, I mean, yes, a lot of states in the South are right to work states. They are, they do have right-wing leaderships. However, struggle is not going to stop in the deep South. I mean, we've seen just early, this year alone, we've seen, strikes in Alabama. If we consider the labor movement, Alabama became the hotspot for the labor movement this year, with the struggle by Amazon workers, fighting for a union, and then of course there was the miners that were striking. These struggles are going to continue to happen because so long as there is oppression, so long as workers are being exploited, no matter what the law is, people are going to rebel, people are going to fight back, people are going to continue to try to better their situation and their conditions, and that's going to be the same for the South. And the movement to build solidarity for Palestine, and also to basically indict the Israeli apartheid system for its crimes. I think that movement is only going to get stronger in the South, and we're going to continue to work hard and build that solidarity.
Right on. Well, Satya Vati from the Answer Coalition in Atlanta, Georgia, thank you so much for joining us here on the show and giving us a window into what we saw in the South this past weekend.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I mean, it's really amazing to hear. I mean, you're from the fake South, Northern Virginia, so I don't know if you're really an expert on this.
Wow,
what I will
Eugene.
say is, for those of us that are real Southerners, that's amazing. I mean, 4,000 people in Raleigh is like the big, I mean, there's of any demonstration, I know the Triangle well, that's like very, very high end for a demonstration on anything. So that's really, really telling, I think, in terms of that particular piece and the overall attitude towards it. And I think another hopeful sign, Rania.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And a few days ago, we spoke to Rania Masri, who was in Raleigh during one of those protests. She had just gotten back. And she spoke at those protests, and then she had told me afterwards, it was quite large and larger than recent years. There is actually like a huge Arab American community in Raleigh.
Well, can I ask you a question about that actually? That I think is relevant. I hate to pigeonhole you here as an Arab American.
You're gonna call me a fake? Are you gonna call me a fake Southerner again? I don't know. It depends.
No, I won't. Not on this show. Maybe tomorrow. But I mean, as you know, there are a number of states in the South where the Arab American population is very large. But of course, a big impact of the 9/11 attacks and the huge rise of Islamophobia was to drop a curtain of fear over many people. I mean, we obviously remember the Palestinian leader Sami al-Arian, who was framed up on a false charge. He had been Bush's campaign director in Florida in 2000, and they turned him into the allegedly the world's worst terrorist. I mean, it was all trumped up. Holy Land 5, which was in Texas. So I say all that to say, and especially the piece you were saying about a new generation of people coming into the streets, if it's also notable to you seeing, not just in the South, but around this country, perhaps a lifting a little bit of that cloud and that fear, especially amongst younger people, that I know was really, the government went into overdrive to scare all Arabs and all Muslims to not be involved in politics. So I don't know. That's not really a question, but I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, I would agree. I think that's absolutely relevant to what's happening right now, especially because, like you said, it was a curtain of fear. After 9/11, a lot of Arabs, I mean, I can't tell you numbers because I didn't take a poll, but from what I felt, there was a kind of disengagement from politics. Like, I don't even want to involve myself or sound like I'm sympathizing with terrorism because I feel like I'm under a microscope right now because of my ethnicity or my religion. And I think that, that has largely shifted for sure. And that's made a huge impact. And there's also the issue of, like, when you have immigrant parents, they usually come to the US and keep their heads down. They don't want to make a ruckus. You know what I mean? They don't want to, be looked at. They want to just fit in. They want to assimilate. And so it's like when you have these kind of, second generation people who were born and raised here, it gives you this added confidence. Like, wait a second, like, I'm actually American and I don't have those sort of hangups that maybe my parents had. And so there's also that ability of people who were born and raised here who don't feel this like constant need to like fit in and assimilate anymore, feeling more confident to speak out. So that makes a huge difference too. But I also think there's, it's not just Arab Americans that are making a difference here.
Sure.
Like we were talking about earlier, there is a younger generation that is, more progressive leaning, and Israel is really attached to like the global right wing in so many ways. It's a right wing country. It's a right wing racist country, and I think the Donald Trump administration also helped shift that, because under Trump, you really did see this special relationship become a right wing special relationship where like Netanyahu and Trump were just, like buddies. And it really exposed that Israel is like a state of Republicans. Like it's like if only Republicans and the most extreme ones were in charge of a country, that's what Israel looks like. And so I think it made it easier for Democrats to see Israel in a different light. So I think that's helped shift the conversation as well. I do want to bring up something though that I think also changed, and this is kind of speaking more to what was happening on the left. I think the Arab Spring protests of 2011 caused a huge fracture in the US Palestine solidarity community. I was in it, I experienced it. There was in a concerted effort by the pro-Israel elements to really try to use the issue of the civil war in Syria to like force it into the Palestine solidarity movement and fracture it. And it kind of worked. For up until about 2015, 2016, Palestine solidarity was on the rise in the US. Almost every other week, there was like some BDS, proposition on a college campus that was being passed by the student government because of all the work being done on college campuses. And that almost overnight felt like it just kind of crumbled because the issue of Syria was deliberately inserted into Palestine solidarity, and people were on different sides of the issue. Some people, wanted intervention and kind of supported what the US was doing. And then other people and I fell on this side of things, were opposed to US intervention and were very much opposed to the US dirty war on Syria, the arming and funding of extremist groups to try and collapse the Syrian government, which also Israel participated in, by the way, by helping arm some of those extremist groups in the Golan. And I did some reporting on this back then. But the point is to say that I think now that time period has sort of passed, and that the war in Syria has wound down. Now it's mostly just an economic war where the U.S. is sanctioning and crippling the country. The hot war has wound down. The U.S. is no longer trying to arm extremists. The U.S. is no longer trying to institute a no-fly zone. Now that that's moved out of the picture, people have sort of come back together. And I say that just to also note, it's important to note there has still till now been an effort, I don't want to talk too much about it, but an effort by people to kind of like try to hack pro-Palestine voices like myself and others whose positions on Syria they didn't like, and try to make it about Syria again and try to divert what's happening in Gaza. And to that, I just say shame on you. Shame on you to trying to silence and attack and smear pro-Palestine voices at a time when Gaza is being carpet bombed just to push your agenda on Syria. Like, really shame on you to people who are doing that. And that's all I'll say on that note. But I think that that's another reason why in activism, we've kind of come back to the central issue. There was a distraction for a few years with the US doing all these dirty wars in the Middle East. But now that that's kind of passed a bit, we're back to understanding the central issue being Palestine. And so are Palestinians, so are Lebanese, so are Jordanians, as we see them protesting at their borders with Palestine, trying to get in and show their solidarity.
No, I think it's an important point, and obviously a piece of the broader imperial strategy. I mean, the Balkanization of the Middle East is heavily directed towards defending Israeli hegemony in the region. And so I appreciate that, and I thank you for that. For those who are just joining us here, you are watching Breakthrough News. We are indeed live. This is part of our ongoing rolling coverage of the Israeli aggression in Palestine. Just to give you a brief note here before we turn to continue to talk about the protests, and you're seeing images next to us, a number of them from from Europe rather, of Palestine solidarity protests. But the ongoing aerial assault, which has also had naval and artillery elements on Gaza, is continuing. At least 200 Palestinians are dead in that conflict, at least 59 of them children. Of course, those death tolls will continue to grow. So that's 200 dead, 59 children. The Israeli side has reported 10 dead, including 2 children. So as we've been saying all along, the disproportionality of the conflict is very, very clear here when you look at that 200 to 10 number. Of course, in the West Bank, dozens of Palestinians have been killed. Protests there, however, are growing. So despite the increase of repression there, we have not seen a decrease in the activity, the popular resistance that's going on there. And inside of 48 Israel, there continues to be ongoing pushes there by the Palestinian population against the eviction in Sheikh Jarrah, against the aggressions that have taken place vis-a-vis the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and also, of course, the pogromist activity that we have seen go on. And as Rania laid out for us earlier, there's a call for a general strike within the Green Line, within Israel, within 48 Palestine, as well as the West Bank, which will be a continuation of that resistance. And of course, we also saw yesterday the United States yet again use its role in the United Nations to block a Security Council resolution to try to prevent there being any sort of pressure. I mean, whether or not that would have stopped Israel, is probably almost certainly not. But just the fact that they're blocking something that maybe wouldn't even have done anything just for a PR reason in a way shows you quite a bit about the U.S. still lock, stock, and smoking barrel here. 700 some odd billion dollars spent for Israel in weapons today as well was announced by the U.S. administration.
Eugene, I'm curious, like, what do you think is the reason? I'm watching the U.S. Repeatedly become an obstacle to these statements coming out, attempted statements out of the UN Security Council. The third time the U.S. has blocked a call for a ceasefire. I can't even understand what the U.S. gets out of that. Like, why not just sign on to a statement, a weak statement calling for a ceasefire? Like, it's actually surprised me just because I don't quite understand what the Biden administration gets out of being an obstacle to a statement at the UN Security Council.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we bring in our next guest, who is someone who I bet could shed some light on that, among other things. We've got Carlos Martinez with us from the United Kingdom, among other things, co-founder of No Cold War, also at the helm there of the Invent the Future blog, one of my favorite blogs. Carlos, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Rania. Good to see you guys.
Well, Carlos, huge demonstrations there in the UK over the weekend, but I don't know if you want to actually opine on what Rania was raising. I think you probably have a good perspective on that, about what is really motivating the United States, its activity at the UN, and its total intransigence on this issue.
Well, that's a massively complicated issue to try and unpack. But I think what you're really seeing with the Biden administration so far in the realms of foreign policy is essentially massive continuity. That he's trying to pursue a kind of progressive leaning profile in terms of domestic policy with the stimulus, with some kind of nod to anti-racist and stop Asian hate type of politics. So he's making certain nods in a progressive direction in that sense. But in terms of the foreign policy, he could, it could be the Trump administration, and Antony Blinken could be Mike Pompeo in what they're doing. And massive support for Israel is one of the biggest constants of US foreign policy since the 1950s. In terms of the arms supplies, in terms of the diplomatic support, there have been numerous votes over the years at the United Nations, in the General Assembly, against Israel's kind of genocidal activities against Palestinian people, against settlements, and so on and so forth. And it's always been the US that voted on the other side. The US has always been it's even broken with its allies in Europe over that. So I think it's just part of a foreign policy package from the Biden administration, which is essentially changing very little. And you can certainly see in relation to China and in relation to Russia that they've picked up the Cold War ball from Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, and they're running with it.
Well, let me also ask you this. The demonstration in London on Saturday, I don't know if it was the biggest one in the world. I think it was. I mean, it was massive, truly massive. Talk about what we saw there and what it means for the political situation there.
Right. So, yeah, as you say, it was a huge demonstration. An estimated 150,000 people marched through the streets from Hyde Park to the Israeli embassy in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And it was, I'm sure, the largest demonstration in the world on this issue on that day. And it was the largest demonstration in Britain for quite some time. You know, there's a very lively rally addressed by quite a few prominent trade unionists, members of parliament, including Jeremy Corbyn, who up until quite recently was leader of the Labour Party and who many millions of us in Britain wish was still the leader of the Labour Party. And furthermore, it wasn't just in London. There were significant demonstrations in Bristol, in Oxford, in Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, Cardiff. There were even small protests in local parks in different suburbs of London. For example, I saw some pictures of a Palestine rally in Brixton, which is historically a centre of resistance for working class and minority communities in London. And then you saw probably that the protests made their way into the world of football, or I think you call it soccer, right? So Leicester City, who won the FA Cup on Saturday, two of their players, Hamza Chowdhury and Wesley Fofana, wrapped themselves in a Palestinian flag as part of their victory celebration. Liverpool star Mohamed Salah, one of the best players in the world, called on world leaders on his Twitter to do everything in their power to stop the killing of innocent people. So there's been a very broad and a very lively mobilization. And I think that connects to a few things. You know, Britain's got a very long-standing connection with the issue of Palestine. Britain was the major state supporter of the Zionist movement in the early days, right? The Balfour Declaration of 1917 announced British support for the establishment of this Jewish ethno-state in Palestine, and that set the wheels in motion for the creation of Israel. So for progressives and anti-imperialists in Britain, it's a foundational issue to stand up for the national rights of Palestinians, just as it's a foundational issue, or it should be, to stand up for Irish independence and unity, just as it was a foundational issue in the 70s and 80s to stand up against apartheid in South Africa and Zimbabwe because of the role of the British ruling class in creating those problems. And to this day, the British government remains a close ally of the Israeli state. It exports hundreds of millions of pounds worth of high-tech weaponry to Israel every year, a good deal of which is directed specifically against the Palestinian people. So I think the British progressive movement feels this strong, long-standing affinity with the Palestinian liberation struggle.
Is this a sign or a rebuke, perhaps, to some of what we've seen over the past few years? I mean, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn. I don't even know what else to describe it, but like a dirty war that was waged against Corbyn and those supporting him, specifically around the issue of him, his long-standing support for the Palestinian people. So to see such a huge response, I mean, is that, I don't know if it's a direct rebuke, but at least a sign that what we saw, that full court press by the supporters of Israel and Zionism, perhaps not as certainly successful in some ways, but maybe not in others.
Yeah, look, that's a great point, and that definitely feeds into it. There's the left and the progressive movement in Britain suffered this enormous political defeat with the elections in December 2019. We had a progressive, anti-war, anti-neoliberal, anti-racist leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, a long-standing supporter of Palestine, a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who'd been leader of the opposition for 4 years. And all of the forces of the right and the center, all of mainstream politics and media piled in on him and attacked him. And the biggest attack vector was his long-standing support for Palestine, which was framed by huge forces across the media and the political spectrum as being a form of anti-Semitism. So he then stepped down after the elections, and since that time, these so-called centrists have won back pretty much the entire commanding heights of the Labour Party. So the left, in terms of its ability to impact the political situation in Britain, has gone from the strongest position it's ever been in to suddenly a relatively weak position. And a lot of people are very angry and very frustrated about that. And as you say, they're angry and frustrated because of the way that it happened, in a completely illegitimate way. The leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the left of the opposition, who is a lifelong and very consistent anti-racist, was presented as a racist, as an anti-Semite, right? And that's the profile that he had in mainstream society. And so I think now, with the COVID situation getting better and people feeling like they can protest and they can go out into the streets, combined with Israel engaged in this terrible, just horrifying onslaught against Palestinians, that you can see, if nothing else, just the sheer imbalance of forces. On the one hand, you've got a occupying nuclear-armed settler colonial apartheid state with billions of dollars of high-tech weaponry facing a population with maybe a few kind of homemade rockets. So I think that's really consolidated into a groundswell of support for Palestine, and maybe that's we can leverage that and create a possibility for the left to get back on its feet, establish some points of unity, and wage some urgently needed fight back around the interests of the working class, around the interests of oppressed communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you also this final question, shifting to a little bit more the international arena. And as I mentioned, you're with No Cold War, which has been doing work all around the world on the issue of the U.S. instigated Cold War with China in particular. Seeing the Security Council mix, I mean, of course, China's position is not an anti-imperialist position per se, but they have been one of the main voices pushing for a quick meeting that the U.S. then said no, then kicked 3 days later. They've been pushing for the statement that would have put some blame on both sides, which, I may not agree with, but certainly is more than what many people in the Security Council have ever supported before. They've even gained some support from some European countries for some of these issues. I mean, how are you evaluating some of that back and forth in the Security Council around this broader issue of a Cold War, of a multipolar world, and as it sort of is shaping the world issues going into the 21st century?
Yeah, another very good point. It's really clear, with China very vocally calling for the involvement of the United States and for an active settlement of the question within a framework of the UN, within a framework of international law, that very much fits into the model of multipolarity and multilateralism that China's been pushing for a long time. And then in stark contrast to that, you have the US saying, no, we don't want to be involved in that kind of framework. We don't want the United Nations to be involved. We don't want the international community to be involved. We're going to give our unequivocal support to our ally, Israel, regardless of what it does. We're going to carry on supplying it with weapons. We're going to carry on supplying it with diplomatic support, media support, propaganda support. And okay, it's bad that there's violence happening, so we're going to send an envoy over. So that becomes really clear to increasingly huge numbers of people in the world, the disparity in the different models of international relations, if you will, that are on offer. You've either got the continuation of US imperialism and hegemony, or you've got a multipolar world, which is a much more democratic, a much more equal system, and that opens up possibilities for sovereignty and indeed for socialism, essentially around the world. So that's a really interesting aspect to it. The other thing that's important to bring in relation to China is this incredible hypocrisy. Like, at the same time, you've got the US State Department claiming that the Chinese government has converted the entire region of Xinjiang into, quotes, an open-air prison. Then you look at the coverage of Gaza, and you see in Jerusalem, in Gaza, people are getting bombed, they're getting tear gassed, they're getting fired on with rubber bullets, hit with rifle butts, evacuated from their homes. But it's Xinjiang that they're calling the open-air prison. Meanwhile, you've probably seen the videos of Muslims in Kashgar, in Urumqi, the big cities of Xinjiang, celebrating Eid, people dancing, enjoying themselves, engaging in their traditional customs. Like, the coverage, the comparison is completely stark. But in terms of the US political class and the US media, Xinjiang is an open-air prison, and Gaza and Jerusalem are complicated situations.
Important point. Yeah, apparently people are being forced to have fun on Eid. Well, Carlos Martinez, really appreciate you joining us. Hope everyone checks out what you're doing at No Cold War. Also, of course, Invent the Future, what I love. And I have to note, you're also the author of End of the Beginning, Lessons from the Soviet Collapse. Hope I got that right, but I've definitely read it actually twice. Very thought-provoking book for those of us interested in socialism in this upcoming century. Thanks again, Carlos, for joining us.
Thank you so much, guys.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I know we've had some super chats. I don't know if we need to catch up on the very fine people who have donated to us. Oh, I can't hear you, Rania.
Huh. That's
there,
weird.
now I can hear you. There we go.
Oh,
there
that was really weird. I was not. Oh, I must have been muted by Juan in the booth. Juan, how dare you?
You just got to throw Juan under the bus like Juan in the booth. Working
yeah,
hard.
I'm just joking. I love Juan. Juan, I love you. I'm sorry.
Wow.
I'm just
Shout out
the
to
worst. So I want to give a shout out to two of our super chats. Faint Signals from Vega, who actually often donates, says, the ethno-supremacist genocidal regime is fast losing grip on the propaganda narrative. It can't happen too soon. Solidarity from Tasmania. And it's interesting when this person says ethno-supremacist genocidal regime, I actually don't know if they're talking about Israel or the U.S. But I guess it's one of the same.
Right?
Right. And then we have That's a Wrap says, thank you for these live streams, amazing interviews, and being a megaphone for suppressed voices. Please reiterate the war crimes committed, specifically when updating the death toll, solidarity, and keep up the amazing work. And yes, can't reiterate enough, on top of the death toll of over 200, including 59 children in Gaza killed, you have the intentional targeting as demonstrated by the proportion of children and women who are part of those numbers. You have intentional targeting of civilians, of residential homes, entire families being wiped out by single airstrikes. Israel is targeting civilians. Like, there is no other way to understand this other than a war against civilians. And what's interesting is that, you had this media building targeted a couple of days ago that we covered on a live stream on Saturday. And Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has actually come out and asked Israel to please provide evidence that Hamas was firing rockets next to that building because they don't see any evidence. And to me, I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, so you're kind of implying that you understand that Israel targeted a building full of international media. And it makes sense, right? Israel wants to make it more difficult for the world to see what's happening in Gaza. Why else would you target media? But it's like, you're in a position to make it stop. You're the US. You're in a position to make it stop. So stop sitting back and acting like, oh, we have no control over Israel. You absolutely do. This is happening because of America. And I also want to make the point, Eugene, that there's this guy Hadi Amar, who the Biden administration sent to Israel. Yes, the US envoy that the Biden administration sent to Israel to go try and help with these behind the scenes negotiations for a ceasefire that isn't happening. And I want to read this update. Where did I put it? Sorry, I have so many windows open now. I might not be able to find it. But it was okay.
Tabs. Come on now, those tabs.
Well, right. Regardless, he was tasked with going.
Did you find it?
Well, it's not even that important to read. It was more just it was an update on, Hadi Amar said he's working on helping both sides come to an agreement. Just a really, really weak comment. And, the thing about this guy is that he's actually half Lebanese, half Palestinian, I believe. And it just made me think to myself, this is the perfect example of how the idea of the symbolic representation is somehow supposed to fix anything is such a ruse. Because here you have a guy who's Middle Eastern ethnicity, who's from this part of the world, and he's still just a tool of the Biden administration. He has no actual say over what happens here. And it's still the same pro-Israel narrative you hear coming out of it. So it's just a reminder that this sort of neoliberal attempt to co-opt the left by giving us little crumbs because they have a person of color or a person of this background now dealing with this issue, a person of Palestinian descent now saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change anything.
Yeah. Well, one thing I just want to note briefly, $735 million weapon sale approved to Israel today. I think it actually might have predated this particular upsurge where they decided they were going to do it, but they approved it today. That includes bombs. So it's a resupply. It's not just randomly $735 million worth of equipment that's going to go sit in some warehouse. It's basically a resupply of the brutal air campaign, also with artillery and naval elements that have been going on in Gaza. As you can see on the screen, has left at least 200 dead, at least 59 children. And that is in comparison to 10 Israelis who have been announced dead and 2 children. So the disproportionality, huge here, 200 to 10. And that 200 number doesn't include dozens, of course, who have been killed by Israeli police and IDF forces in the West Bank as part of growing protests there. So a couple things here just before we close, Rania, and you know, this is ongoing rolling coverage. We're going to, as long as this is a hot conflict, try to be bringing you something live around 3 p.m. Going forward here. So continue to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube and hit that bell so you can get alerts when we are going live. Obviously, this is a dynamic situation. Of course, follow us at BT Newsroom across all your social media platforms, but definitely subscribe on YouTube and hit that bell because we want to be on top of this to the extent we can. But, you know, there's a few different pieces that I think that we wanted to touch on here in a lot of ways. I think that there was a couple of videos that you had, Rania, that you wanted to pull up here and react to. So before we close, maybe let's touch that.
I think it's important to see what life on the ground in Gaza looks like right now. So there's this video that we saw on Twitter that got posted of, it was after an Israeli airstrike. It says after Israeli warplanes bombed the Al-Shawa building in Gaza City, leading to 2 Palestinian deaths and 10 other injuries. As we've mentioned, the Israelis are targeting residential buildings. So can we pull up this video? I think it's important for viewers to get an idea of just, you know, we can talk about it all day, but we have images of what Palestinians are going through right now. And this one's pretty heart-wrenching. So, I mean, this is a scene that is playing out over, and I mean, this is just one Israeli airstrike. The Israelis have launched hundreds. This is just the aftermath of one Israeli airstrike. You can see the chaos. You guys remember, this is happening during a pandemic. The Israelis have vaccinated a majority of their population, and they've largely moved on from COVID. Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, don't have that luxury. And from what I understand, the Israelis actually bombed a clinic that included one of the only laboratories in Gaza that can actually test for COVID. So on top of a pandemic, you know, this video, and it's this video, there's like dozens and dozens of it you can go look at on Twitter. This is just a more recent one. And it just gives you an idea of what life is like for people in Gaza right now. This is not okay. And I want to follow this up with another video. And it's a video of Joe Biden. I believe it's like 1986. I'm throwing that number. I'm pretty sure it's from 1986. And he's explaining how important Israel is to America. So I want you to really get a look at this video we just showed you from Gaza. And then let's take a look at what Biden had to say about Israel in 1986.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
So I
Well, I think
want
it's important to get into the heart of the issue. I mean, of why the United States is backing Israel 100% no matter what. I mean, there are a lot of different things that factor into it, but the basic core argument is, and again, is it was, Carlos was pointing out the long history of British imperialism and establishing currently in Israel. The Zionist leadership was writing to the leadership of the British imperial forces saying, if you help us set up a country, we will do what needs to be done. We will be the Western hegemon in this broader region, the crossroads of the world, near the so-called Near East. And in fact, that has been the role that Israel has played, and it continues to be really indispensable to the United States, given the geostrategic importance of the broader region, to have this entity that at all costs will protect U.S. hegemony. So in a way, even though it's a disgusting statement, I'm almost glad it exists, Rania, because it actually, there it is in the words of Joe Biden, our current president, really laying out exactly why in 2021, even though he said that in the mid 1980s, why the U.S. is sticking to basically the exact same position of complete and total support, no apologies under any circumstances, no matter what they do. It's very revealing and I think very important.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember the history too. Israel was a very important element of America's Cold War strategy, helping to, during the Cold War, the anti-colonialist leftist struggle in the Middle East and around the world really was 100% attached to the pro-Palestine struggle. So all of the leftist organizations, leftist groups in the Middle East that were destroyed by the U.S. during the Cold War, Israel played a role in that because it was also Israel helping to destroy Palestine. The Palestinian resistance. And you see something similar today. When you look across the Middle East, the flavor of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle in the Middle East, it takes more of an Islamist flavor now, right? You have Iran, you have Hezbollah, you have Hamas. That said, that is resistance to imperialism. And they're also resistance to Israeli aggression because those organizations, like their leftist predecessors, saw Israel as an arm of American imperialism in the region. And so through Israel, the U.S. is able to fight against those that challenge its hegemony. Israel is the bulldog is the U.S. puts, out to go against Iran. So Israel's attacks on Lebanon, Israel's attacks on Syria, Israel's attacks on Iran. This isn't just about Israel trying to control the region. This is actually about America trying to control the region. And we shouldn't forget that because behind Israel is America. And on that note, Eugene, is there anything else you'd like to add before we maybe give one last update?
No, I think that's fine. We've touched a lot, and there's more we can touch, and we'll continue, to bring people coverage here. Raymond Random, thank you for your donation there in the super chat as we bring this to a close. And just to also let people know, please, if you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching anywhere else, go to YouTube, subscribe, hit the bell, get the alerts, because like I said, this is part of our ongoing rolling coverage here on Breakthrough News. We've obviously been going live much more than we normally do because we want to be able to bring people updates as it comes, as this continues to be a major flashpoint on the world stage. So the easiest way to continue to follow us is to subscribe on YouTube and hit that bell. But of course, follow us at BT Newsroom across all your social media platforms, and you will also be able to see what we're doing. But just to leave it here as we wrap, ongoing Israeli aggression all across Palestine, the ongoing brutal air war continuing, at least 200 dead, at least 59 children, that is in Gaza. Over the extent of this particular conflict, 200 dead, 59 children. The Israelis reporting 10 dead and 2 children. So again, the disproportionality there of what's happening and really why we're calling it Israeli aggression and not both sidesing it just right there in your face. Dozens have been killed in the West Bank, where protests continue to grow, and also inside of 48 Israel, there continues to be turmoil as very racist mobs continue to attack Palestinians there. Palestinians continue to stand up. There's a general strike in other areas of both inside quote-unquote Israel and inside of the West Bank that will be happening tomorrow. That's been called for tomorrow. So there'll be ongoing popular resistance as well. And of course, we are not anticipating a quick end, sadly, to the air attacks on Gaza because of the statements that were made over the weekend by the Israeli government of how they plan to continue it into the middle of the week and perhaps deep into the week, and what we've seen the machinations of the United States to prevent any sort of pressure on the international arena that could potentially curtail that. And I will note that they have also been joined by Canada, by France, by Germany, by many other countries in offering this uncritical bodyguard-like support to Israel as we are. So again, 200 dead, 59 children in Gaza, dozens of Palestinians killed in the West Bank, people continuing to be faced by racist mobs inside of Israel, Palestinian people, and 10 Israelis killed, including 2 children. So that is where we are going to leave it now. That is where the conflict stands. But of course, check us out, follow us, subscribe, hit the alerts, and we'll continue to try to bring you as much as we possibly can on this conflict. But thank you again for everyone who watched us here on this rolling live coverage of the ongoing Israeli aggression in Palestine here on Breakthrough News.